They thought inheriting an abandoned farm shelter meant a few acres of worthless land and maybe a roof that didn't leak. But when this elderly couple pulled back the stone wall in the forgotten cellar, what they found hidden beneath decades of silence was worth over $250 million. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridge when Martha stepped onto the small wooden porch of their mobile home, coffee cup warming her weathered hands. The steam curled up into the cold Montana morning, disappearing into air so crisp it hurt to breathe too deep. She was 78 years old, thin as a rail, with silver hair she kept in a neat bun and eyes that still sparkled with the kindness of someone who'd spent 40 years teaching children to read. Beside her, the screen door creaked open. Eugene shuffled out in his worn slippers, cardigan wrapped tight around his frame. He was 79, stooped from decades of farm work, hands gnarled like old tree roots. But when he looked at Martha, those hands always steadied, always reached for hers. "Cold one today," he murmured, settling into the plastic chair beside her. "Mm-hmm," she replied, not looking away from the horizon. "Radiators acting up again." Eugene nodded slowly. They both knew what that meant. Another bill they couldn't quite afford. Another choice between heat and groceries. Another month of stretching Social Security checks like taffy until they snapped. Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park sat on the outskirts of a town too small to have a name anyone remembered. There were 11 trailers total, most of them older than the residents inside. The place smelled like firewood and fried eggs, and everyone knew everyone's business before breakfast was done. Martha and Eugene had lived here for 9 years, ever since Eugene's back gave out and the ranch where he'd worked let him go. Their trailer was number 7, painted a faded turquoise with white trim that peeled like sunburned skin. Inside, everything was clean but worn. The carpet had pathways worn smooth from decades of footsteps. The furniture came from thrift stores and yard sales, mismatched but loved. They'd been married for 53 years, met at a church social in 1971 when Martha was teaching 2nd grade and Eugene was working his first harvest season. He'd asked her to dance even though he didn't know how. She'd said yes even though he stepped on her feet 3 times. By the end of the night, they both knew. Life hadn't been easy. They'd never had children, though they'd tried for years. Eugene's work was hard and paid little. Martha's teaching salary barely covered rent, but they had each other, and somehow that had always been enough. Now, in the autumn of their lives, things had gotten harder. Eugene's medications cost more each month. Martha's hip needed surgery they couldn't afford. Their truck was held together with prayers and duct tape. But every morning they sat on that porch together, watching the sun rise over the mountains, holding hands like teenagers. "Mail come yet?" Eugene asked, though he knew the answer. It was only 6:30 in the morning. Martha smiled. Not unless Ed learned to drive in the dark. Ed was the mailman, 72 himself, who drove a Jeep with no muffler and always honked twice when he pulled up. You could hear him coming from a mile away. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind only decades together can create. Somewhere down the row, a dog barked, a door slammed, the park was waking up. By 8 o'clock, Martha was inside making oatmeal on their 2-burner stove, while Eugene sat at the tiny kitchen table reading yesterday's newspaper for the 3rd time. They couldn't afford a subscription, so their neighbor Gladys saved hers and brought them over every few days. "Says here gas prices are going up again," Eugene muttered. Martha didn't respond. They both knew it didn't matter. They barely drove anywhere anymore. The oatmeal was plain, just water and oats, with a sprinkle of cinnamon Martha had been stretching for 2 months. They ate slowly, savoring the warmth if not the taste. That's when they heard it. The unmistakable double honk of Ed's Jeep. Eugene looked up, surprised. "Mail's early today." Martha wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside. Ed was already at their box, a thick envelope in his weathered hands. When he saw Martha, his expression shifted. Something like concern, maybe pity. "Morning, Martha," he said, handing her the envelope. "This one came certified. Had to sign for it myself since you weren't here at the post office." Martha took it carefully, reading the return address. Hanson and Marks, attorneys at law, Helena, Montana. Her stomach dropped. Lawyers never meant good news, not for people like them. "Thank you, Ed," she managed. He nodded, tipped his hat, and drove off with his usual roar. Eugene was standing in the doorway when she turned around. "What is it?" "Lawyer's office," she said quietly. "Helena." They stared at the envelope like it might bite. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, Eugene reading over her shoulder. The letter was formal, typed on heavy paper that felt expensive. "Dear Mr. Eugene Thomas, we regret to inform you of the passing of Walter Eugene Thomas, who died on September 14th of this year. As per his last will and testament, you have been named as the sole beneficiary of his estate, including all property, structures, and possessions located at the address below. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the transfer of said property and the execution of the will." Martha read it 3 times before the words made sense. Eugene just stared, mouth slightly open. "Walter," he finally whispered. "Uncle Walter." Martha looked at him. "Your mother's brother?" Eugene nodded slowly, sinking into the plastic chair on the porch. "Haven't seen him since I was maybe 12, 13 years old. He came to Mama's funeral in 1983, stayed an hour, didn't talk to anybody, just stood in the back. I didn't even know he was still alive," Martha said. "Neither did I." They sat together, the letter between them as the morning sun climbed higher. Walter Thomas had always been a mystery. Eugene's mother rarely spoke of him, and when she did, it was with a mixture of sadness and frustration. He'd left home young. Nobody knew where he went or what he did. Sent a card at Christmas for a few years. Then even those stopped. Became a ghost in the family history, someone mentioned in whispers and incomplete stories. The address listed was somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains, about 90 miles from where they sat. A place Eugene vaguely remembered visiting once as a child. He recalled a long dirt road, dense trees, and a stone house that looked like it had grown from the mountain itself. "What do you think it means?" Martha asked. "What kind of property?" Eugene shook his head. Knowing Walter, probably a shack and some worthless acres. Man lived like a hermit. Mama used to say he was paranoid, didn't trust banks or people or much of anything. "Still," Martha said carefully, "it's something. Maybe we could sell it. Even a little bit of land might help with your medications." Eugene looked at her, saw the hope she was trying to hide, and felt his heart break a little. She was always the optimist, always finding the silver lining, even when the clouds were black as coal. "Yeah," he said softly. "Maybe." By noon they'd called the law office. A woman with a professional voice explained the basics. The property was registered in Walter's name, no liens, no debts. The will was straightforward. Everything went to Eugene. They could take possession immediately, but someone would need to sign papers in person. "We'll drive up," Eugene said. "See it for ourselves." The woman hesitated. "Mr. Thomas, I should mention, the property is quite remote. There's no power or water service to the address. It's been vacant for approximately 6 weeks since your uncle's passing." "Understood," Eugene replied. After he hung up, he looked at Martha. "Want to take a drive tomorrow?" She smiled. "Been a while since we had an adventure?" That evening, word spread through Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park faster than wildfire. Gladys came over with a casserole she claimed was leftovers, but they both knew she'd made fresh. She wanted details. "So you're inheriting a whole property?" she asked, eyes wide behind her thick glasses. "Appears so," Eugene said. "Could be worth something," Gladys pressed. Land prices are crazy these days. Martha poured her tea. We don't know anything yet, Gladys. Could be nothing but dirt and memories. But Gladys wasn't the only curious one. By the time the sun set, 3 other neighbors had found excuses to stop by. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had advice. Most of it involved selling quick and taking whatever they could get. Don't let those city lawyers cheat you, old Frank from Trailer 3 warned. They'll try to take fees and commissions and leave you with pennies. Get it appraised first, Sarah from Trailer 9 suggested. Don't sign nothing till you know what it's worth. Eugene and Martha listened politely, thanked everyone, and closed the door feeling more overwhelmed than before. That night, lying in their narrow bed with the sound of wind rattling the trailer's thin walls, Martha whispered into the darkness. Are you scared? Eugene was quiet for a moment. Of what? Of hoping too much, of this being nothing, of being disappointed again. He found her hand under the worn quilt. We've been disappointed before. We'll survive it again if we have to. But maybe, she whispered, maybe this time it's different. Maybe your uncle left you something that could help. Something that could mean we don't have to choose between your pills and fixing the heater. Eugene squeezed her hand. Let's just go see it. No expectations, just curiosity. Okay, she agreed. But neither of them slept much that night. The next morning dawned grey and cold, the kind of October day that promised winter was coming fast. Eugene and Martha were up before sunrise, moving quietly through their small space. Martha packed sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. Eugene checked the truck's oil and tire pressure twice. Their truck was a 1994 Ford, navy blue under layers of rust and dirt. The passenger door stuck sometimes. The radio only got 2 stations, but the engine was solid, and Eugene had kept it running through sheer stubbornness and mechanical know-how. By 7 o'clock, they were pulling out of Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park. Gladys stood on her porch watching them go, waving like they were heading off to war. The drive took them west into the mountains. The highway was smooth at first, cutting through valleys where cattle grazed and old barns leaned at impossible angles. They passed through towns barely bigger than intersections, gas stations that looked frozen in 1965, churches with empty parking lots. Martha watched the landscape roll by, remembering. I taught in a school like that once, she said, pointing to a small brick building. 32 students, 6 grades, 1 room. Eugene smiled. You ever regret it? Teaching? Not once, she said. You? Ranching? She nodded. He thought about it. Nah, body might regret it, but my heart don't. They drove on, the road climbing higher. The trees thickened, pine and fir pressing close to the asphalt. The air through the cracked window grew sharper, colder, cleaner. Eugene's memories of this place were fuzzy and fragmented. He'd been maybe 10 years old when his mother brought him here. He remembered feeling scared of the dark trees, of the silence, of Uncle Walter's intense stare. The old man hadn't said much, just watched Eugene with eyes that seemed to look right through him. Take this turn, Martha said, reading the directions they'd printed at the library. The truck swung onto a dirt road that immediately narrowed, branches scraping the sides. The road wasn't maintained, just 2 ruts with grass growing between them. They bounced over rocks and potholes, the suspension groaning. You sure this is right? Eugene asked, gripping the steering wheel. Martha checked the paper. Says 3.7 miles on Forest Service Road 42. This is it. They drove slowly, the forest pressing closer. Sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. The road climbed steadily, winding around boulders and fallen logs someone had chainsawed just enough to squeeze past. Then, suddenly, the trees opened up. Eugene stopped the truck. Before them lay a clearing maybe 5 acres wide, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. In the center stood a stone house, squat and solid, built from river rock and mortar. The roof was intact, covered in moss and pine needles. 2 chimneys rose from either end. The windows were dark, some shuttered, others just vacant holes. To the left, a barn had collapsed in on itself, grey wood scattered like broken bones. To the right, old farming equipment rusted in tall grass, machinery from another era slowly being reclaimed by the earth. The place looked abandoned, forgotten, left behind by time itself. Martha's hope deflated visibly. "Oh," she said quietly. Eugene said nothing, just put the truck in gear and rolled forward slowly. The driveway was overgrown, but he could still make out where it had been. He parked near the house, turned off the engine, and sat in the silence. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean waves. A raven called from somewhere high up. Otherwise, nothing. "Well," Eugene finally said, "let's take a look." They climbed out of the truck slowly, joints stiff from the drive. The air was cold enough to see their breath. Martha wrapped her thin jacket tighter. The stone house was bigger up close than it appeared from the road. The walls were thick, each stone carefully placed and fitted. The front door was solid wood, weathered silver by decades of mountain weather. Eugene tried the handle, locked. "Windows," Martha suggested. They walked around the structure. The windows on the first floor were shuttered from inside. The second floor was the same, but near the back they found one window with a broken shutter hanging by a single hinge. Eugene peered inside. Darkness. He could make out shapes, furniture covered in sheets, a stone fireplace. "Doesn't look like anyone's been here in years," he said. They continued around the house. The back had a small covered porch, sagging but still standing. Stone steps led down to what looked like root cellar doors, the kind that opened up from the ground at an angle. Martha stopped. "What's that?" Eugene looked where she was pointing. Near the collapsed barn, half hidden by tall grass, was another structure. Smaller, built into a hillside with a heavy metal door facing them. "Storm shelter, maybe," Eugene said. "Or another cellar." They walked toward it, grass soaking their shoes. The door was rust red, but solid. A heavy padlock hung from the latch, old but unbroken. Eugene pulled a ring of keys from his pocket. The lawyer had mailed them yesterday via overnight delivery. 3 keys total, each labeled in careful handwriting. House, barn, shelter. His hands shook slightly as he found the one marked shelter and inserted it into the padlock. It stuck at first, rust and time fighting against him. Then, with a grinding sound that echoed across the clearing, it opened. Martha moved closer as Eugene removed the lock and pulled the heavy door. It swung open on hinges that squealed in protest, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Cold air rushed out, dry and stale, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something almost metallic. Eugene pulled out a small flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing steps carved from stone, walls the same, everything precise and intentional. "Careful," Martha whispered. They descended slowly, Eugene first, Martha right behind, one hand on his shoulder. 12 steps down, then they stood in a chamber about 15 feet square. The flashlight beam swept across the space. It was empty. Completely empty. Just stone walls, stone floor, stone ceiling. No shelves, no storage, nothing. "Huh," Eugene said, disappointment clear in his voice. "Guess it was just a shelter after all." But Martha wasn't listening. She'd moved to the far wall, running her hand across the stone. "Eugene," she said quietly, "come here." He walked over, shining the light where she indicated. The stones there were different, cleaner, the mortar between them fresher, lighter in color, and the pattern, the way they fit together, was almost too perfect. "This isn't the same," Martha said. "Look at the other walls. Those stones are rough, natural. These are cut, shaped." Eugene leaned closer, his heart starting to beat faster. He pressed his palm against the wall. It felt solid, cold. But then he noticed something. A slight depression in one stone, barely visible, and next to it another, and another. They formed a pattern, deliberate, intentional. "Walter," he whispered, "what did you do?" Martha's teacher instincts kicked in. She started examining the stones systematically, top to bottom, left to right. Eugene joined her, both of them running fingers over every surface, looking for anything unusual. It was Martha who found it, a stone about chest height, slightly smaller than the others. When she pressed it, it moved inward with a soft click. They both jumped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound like something waking from a very long sleep, a seam appeared in the wall. Vertical, then horizontal. A door, a section of wall maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, separating from the rest. Eugene and Martha stood frozen, flashlight beam trembling in Eugene's hand. The stone door had moved inward about an inch, enough to show darkness beyond. No hinges visible, no handle, just an opening that hadn't existed moments before. Eugene stepped forward, placed both hands on the door, and pushed. It swung inward smoothly, almost silently, as if the hinges had been oiled recently. Impossible, but true. Beyond was darkness. Complete darkness. And from that darkness came a breath of air so dry and cold it felt like touching winter itself. Eugene raised the flashlight, and the beam disappeared into a space far larger than should exist beneath a hillside in the Montana wilderness. They could see stone steps descending deeper, wider than before, each step perfect and level. "My God," Martha breathed. Eugene's hand found hers. They squeezed tight, neither wanting to let go. "Should we?" Martha asked. Eugene thought about his Uncle Walter, the man who'd lived alone in these mountains, who'd trusted no one, who'd left everything to a nephew he hadn't seen in 4 decades. He thought about the careful way these stones were placed, the hidden mechanism, the impossible door. Whatever was down there, Walter had protected it, preserved it, kept it secret for reasons Eugene couldn't begin to understand. "Yeah," he said finally, "we should." Together, hand in hand, flashlight beam guiding them forward, they stepped through the stone door and began their descent into a secret that had waited in darkness for longer than either of them could imagine. The stone steps descended far deeper than Eugene expected. He counted them quietly as they went down. 10, 15, 20. The air grew colder with each step, but not damp like a normal cellar. This was dry cold, controlled, almost artificial. Martha's grip on his shoulder tightened. "How far does this go?" "I don't know," he whispered back, though there was no reason to whisper. The silence down here felt sacred somehow, like speaking too loud might shatter something fragile. At step 32, they reached the bottom. Eugene swept the flashlight across the space, and both of them stopped breathing. They stood at the entrance to a massive underground chamber. The ceiling arched high above them, maybe 15 feet up, carved from solid rock and reinforced with steel beams. The walls stretched out in both directions, disappearing beyond the flashlight's reach. But what stopped their hearts wasn't the size. It was what filled the space. Display cases, dozens of them, hundreds maybe. Each one lit from within by some kind of soft internal lighting that had clicked on when they entered, triggered by their movement or presence. The cases stood in neat rows, like a museum after hours, each one containing something that gleamed or shimmered, or simply waited in preserved perfection. "Eugene," Martha breathed, "what is this place?" He couldn't answer, couldn't move. His mind was trying to process what his eyes were seeing but failing completely. The nearest case stood about chest high, made of what looked like thick glass or acrylic, sealed tight. Inside, arranged on dark velvet, were coins. Gold coins, dozens of them, each in its own small depression in the fabric. The light caught their surfaces, making them glow like tiny suns. Eugene stepped closer, legs moving on autopilot. He leaned down to read the small brass plaque mounted on the case's base. St. Gordon's Double Eagle Gold Coins, 1907 High Relief. Complete set. Authenticated 1989. Estimated value at acquisition, $112,000. His knees went weak. Martha had moved to the next case. Inside were stamps, tiny squares of paper arranged in neat rows behind glass. Her voice shook as she read the plaque aloud. Inverted Jenny stamps, 1918, block of 4, authenticated 1976, estimated value $980,000. They looked at each other, the flashlight beam shaking between them. "This isn't possible," Eugene whispered. But it was. It was right in front of them, real and solid and terrifyingly valuable. They moved deeper into the chamber, case after case revealing treasures that shouldn't exist in an underground vault beneath a forgotten Montana farm. Roman coins still bearing the faces of emperors dead 2,000 years. Silver bars stamped with marks from the California gold rush. Medals from wars fought and won before either of them were born. One case held nothing but pocket watches, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship. 18-carat gold cases, movements visible through crystal backs, ticking away the seconds with mechanical precision. The plaque read, Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, and Breguet pocket watches. Various dates 1860 through 1930. Complete collection. Value $3.6 million. Martha made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. $3 million for watches. Eugene couldn't speak. His throat had closed up. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. They moved to the next row. Here the cases were larger, positioned at eye level on pedestaled stands, and inside them were paintings, actual paintings. Oil on canvas, colors still vibrant, preserved behind climate-controlled glass. The first showed a woman in Renaissance dress, her eyes following them as they approached. The plaque read, Attributed to the school of Leonardo da Vinci, circa 1510. Authenticated 1992. Provenance documented. Value $18 million. "Oh my God," Martha whispered. "Oh my God, Eugene, this can't be real." But it was. The next case held a landscape, mountains and sky rendered in brushstrokes so delicate they seemed to breathe. Signed by someone whose name Eugene recognized from Martha's art history books. $14 million. And the next, and the next, and the next. They walked through the chamber in a daze, no longer reading every plaque, unable to process the magnitude of what surrounded them. Impressionist paintings, sculptures in bronze and marble, ancient Greek pottery that belonged in the Metropolitan Museum, illuminated manuscripts from medieval monasteries, jade carvings from dynasties whose names Eugene couldn't pronounce. Near the back of the chamber they found cases containing jewelry. Not costume jewelry, not the kind you bought at department stores. These were pieces that had belonged to royalty. Diamond necklaces that had graced the necks of duchesses. Ruby rings sized for fingers that had signed treaties. Emerald tiaras that once crowned heads, now dust in graves. One case held a single piece, a brooch shaped like a butterfly, its wings made of diamonds and sapphires so perfectly cut they seemed to flutter in the light. The plaque was simple. Fabergé, 1903. Imperial Commission. Last known location, St. Petersburg, 1917. Recovered, 1981. Value, $23 million. Martha sank down onto a bench Eugene hadn't noticed, positioned against the wall. She put her face in her hands and began to cry. Not sad tears, shocked tears, overwhelmed tears, the kind that come when your brain simply cannot hold another impossible thing. Eugene sat beside her, putting his arm around her thin shoulders. They sat together in that underground palace of wonders, two elderly people in thrift store clothes, surrounded by more wealth than they could comprehend. "How?" Martha finally managed. "How did Walter get all this? Did he steal it? Are we sitting in a criminal's vault?" Eugene didn't answer because he didn't know. But something about the way everything was displayed, the meticulous documentation, the careful preservation, didn't feel like the work of a thief. This felt like something else, something more like devotion. "There," Martha said, pointing. Her eyes had cleared, and the teacher in her had emerged, organized, logical, looking for answers. Across from where they sat, against the far wall, was a desk, a simple wooden desk that looked almost absurd in its plainness compared to everything else in the chamber. On top of it sat a lamp, a leather blotter, and a single thick book bound in dark leather. They approached it together, Eugene's hand resting on the small of Martha's back. The lamp clicked on when Eugene touched it, revealing the desktop more clearly. Everything was neat, organized. A cup held pens lined up by size. Papers were stacked in perfect alignment. And the book, the journal, sat dead center, closed but waiting. Eugene opened it carefully, half expecting it to crumble. But the leather was soft and well-maintained, the pages thick and clean. The first page held a single line in careful handwriting. The Walter Thomas Collection. Begun May 7th, 1956. God forgive me for what I had to see to gather these pieces, and God bless those who lost them first. Eugene turned the page. What followed was an itemized list written in the same precise hand. Each entry included a description, a date acquired, a location, a price paid, and a story. The stories were short, just a paragraph or two, but they painted pictures that made Eugene's chest ache. Entry 14. Gold menorah, German, circa 1880. Acquired from estate sale, Munich, 1963. Original owner, Rabbi Abraham Goldstein, perished Dachau, 1943. Family line extinct. Purchased legally from German estate office. Price paid, 470 Deutsche Marks. Returned to the light so it shall not be forgotten. Entry 47. Oil painting, French countryside. Signed Monet, 1894. Acquired Paris, 1971. Recovered from sealed apartment previously owned by Jewish family deported to Auschwitz, 1942. No surviving heirs found after 6-year search. Purchased legally through French Ministry of Culture. Price paid, 84,000 francs. Preserved so beauty survives when people cannot. Entry after entry told similar stories. Pieces lost in the Holocaust. Artworks stolen by Nazis and hidden. Treasures seized during World War II and never returned. Items that had belonged to families who ceased to exist, whose names were erased, whose histories were buried. But also other pieces. Ones found in estate sales of forgotten millionaires. Collections abandoned when old houses were demolished. Items rescued from attics and basements before they were destroyed. Each one documented, each one legally purchased, each one carefully preserved. Martha read over Eugene's shoulder, her breath catching every few entries. "He was trying to save them," she whispered. "All these things that would have been lost or destroyed or forgotten. He was building an archive." Eugene kept reading, page after page. The entries spanned decades, 1956 to just weeks before Walter's death. The final entry was dated August 23rd, the year Walter died. Entry 378. Diamond bracelet, Russian. Fabergé, 1908. Acquired at estate auction, Geneva. Original owner, Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna. Believed lost after family execution, 1918. Rediscovered in Switzerland, 2024. Purchased legally at auction. Price paid, 620,000 Swiss francs. The last piece. My work is complete. May whoever finds this understand what I could not do in life. These pieces deserve light. They deserve to be seen. They deserve to tell the stories of those who owned them first. I am too old, too tired, too broken by what I learned gathering them. I leave this burden to someone with more courage than I possessed. Walter Eugene Thomas. Eugene's hands shook so hard Martha had to take the journal from him. She placed it back on the desk gently, then guided him to the bench again. They sat in silence for a long time. The lights in the cases glowed softly around them, each one illuminating a piece of history, a fragment of someone's life, a memory made physical. "How much?" Eugene finally asked. "All of it together. How much do you think?" Martha shook her head. "I don't know. I can't even add numbers that big in my head." "But Eugene, the plaques, they list estimated values from when he acquired them. Some of these pieces, they've probably doubled or tripled in value since then." Eugene stood slowly and walked back to the desk. Beneath the journal was a folder, dark brown leather, embossed with Walter's initials. He opened it. Inside were appraisals. Professional appraisals from firms in New York, London, Geneva, Paris. Each one dated within the last 5 years, each one listing items from the collection with current estimated values. And at the very bottom of the folder, a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note, total estimated value of complete collection as of January current year, $253,412,000, verified by 3 independent appraisal firms. Documentation proving legal acquisition of all pieces stored in Vault Box 14, First Security Bank, Helena. Everything is clean. Everything is yours. I'm sorry I couldn't be braver. W.T. The paper slipped from Eugene's fingers and drifted to the floor like a leaf. $253 million. The number was so large it stopped meaning anything. It was just sounds, just syllables, not money, not real. Martha picked up the paper and read it herself. Then she sat down at the desk very carefully, like her legs had stopped working. "We need to leave," she said quietly. "What?" "We need to leave right now. Go back up. Seal this place. Think." Eugene nodded. She was right. They couldn't stay here. Couldn't process this. Needed air and light and the normal world. They moved back through the chamber, past fortunes and histories and stories frozen in glass. The lights dimmed behind them as they walked, triggered by the same motion sensors that had turned them on. By the time they reached the stone stairs, the vault behind them had fallen back into darkness. They climbed slowly, Eugene's bad back protesting, Martha's hip aching. 32 steps up, then through the hidden stone door, then 12 more steps to the surface. The afternoon sun felt like a physical blow. Eugene stumbled, catching himself against the shelter's metal door. The mountains, the trees, the rusted barn, the forgotten farmhouse, everything looked exactly the same. But nothing was the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. Martha closed the shelter door, and Eugene replaced the padlock with fingers that wouldn't quite cooperate. They walked back to the truck in silence, climbed in, and sat staring through the windshield at the stone house. "Did that just happen?" Martha asked. Eugene turned to look at her. Really look at her. His wife of 53 years, the woman who'd taught him kindness, who'd held his hand through poverty and pain, who'd never once complained about the life he couldn't give her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and she looked more frightened than he'd ever seen her. "Yeah," he said, "it happened." "What do we do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What did 2 elderly people living in a mobile home park do when they suddenly inherited $250 million worth of art and treasures hidden in a secret vault in the Montana wilderness? "I don't know," Eugene admitted. "I honestly don't know." They sat there as the sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening across the clearing. Neither of them suggested looking at the main house. Neither wanted to discover what else Walter might have hidden. This was already too much, already more than they could carry. Finally, as the light started to fade and the temperature dropped, Eugene started the truck. They drove back down the rutted Forest Service road in silence, branches scraping the sides, the truck bouncing over stones and roots. When they reached the highway, Eugene pulled over. His hands were shaking too hard to drive safely. Martha took the wheel without asking, and they switched places. She drove them home slowly, carefully, while Eugene stared out the window, seeing nothing but display cases and brass plaques and impossible numbers. What happens next will test everything they believe about right and wrong, about keeping secrets and telling truth, and about whether two ordinary people can protect something extraordinary when powerful forces come looking for it. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. It was after dark when they pulled into Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park. The porch lights glowed yellow along the row of trailers, including their own. Gladys was standing outside her trailer in a bathrobe, clearly waiting for them. "How'd it go?" she called out. Martha rolled down the window. "Just an old place. Lots of work needed. We're tired, Gladys. Talk tomorrow?" Gladys looked disappointed but nodded. "Sure thing, honey. Sleep well." Inside their small trailer, everything was exactly as they'd left it that morning. The breakfast dishes still in the sink, the newspaper still on the table, the coffee pot still half full. But the space felt different now, smaller, like it belonged to different people, people who didn't know what Eugene and Martha now knew. Martha locked the door and drew all the curtains, something she never did. Eugene sat at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. "We can't tell anyone," Martha said firmly. "Not yet. Not until we figure out what this means." "Agreed," Eugene said. They made sandwiches they didn't eat, poured coffee they didn't drink, sat across from each other at the small table while the clock on the wall ticked away seconds that felt heavier than before. "The journal," Martha said finally. Walter spent his whole life gathering those pieces. He documented everything, made sure it was all legal. "But why hide it?" Eugene asked. "If it was all legal, why not put it in a museum? Why not donate it? Why bury it in a mountain?" Martha thought about that. Fear, maybe, of it being taken, of people not understanding, of it being broken up and sold off piece by piece. Or shame, Eugene added quietly. "Did you see what he wrote? God forgive me for what I had to see. He was buying pieces from the Holocaust, Martha. From people who died in camps. From families that ceased to exist. Maybe he felt like he was profiting from tragedy." "But he wasn't," Martha said. "He was preserving, protecting, making sure those stories didn't disappear completely." "We don't know that's how others would see it." They fell silent again. Outside, a dog barked. A car door slammed. Normal sounds from a normal evening in a normal place, except nothing was normal anymore. "The lawyers," Eugene said. "We have to tell the lawyers. They need to know what's on the property." "Do they?" Martha asked carefully. "The will just said you inherit the property and everything on it. They don't need to know what everything is. Not yet." Eugene looked at her. "You want to keep it secret?" "I want to think," she said. "I want time to understand what Walter wanted, why he left it to you specifically. There has to be a reason, Eugene. Out of everyone in the world, he chose you. I barely knew him. Maybe that's exactly why." Eugene rubbed his face. His medication needed refilling in 3 days. They had $17 in their checking account. The power bill was due Friday, and somewhere 90 miles away, $253 million worth of treasure sat in darkness, waiting for a decision they had no idea how to make. "My head hurts," he said. Martha stood and moved behind him, putting her hands on his shoulders. "Mine too. Let's sleep. Maybe the morning will bring clarity." But neither of them slept. They lay in their narrow bed, the trailer creaking around them, and stared at the ceiling. Eugene's mind raced through everything they'd seen. The gold coins, the paintings, the jewelry, the journal entries, Walter's handwriting, the final appraisal, $253 million. Beside him, Martha's breathing was too controlled to be sleep. She was thinking, too, planning maybe, her teacher brain organizing information, categorizing, prioritizing. "Martha," he whispered. "Yeah? Are you scared?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Terrified. Me too. But also," she continued, "I keep thinking about what we could do. The medicine you need, the surgery for my hip, maybe help Evelyn down the street with her granddaughter's college. Maybe fix Frank's roof before winter. Maybe actually have heat this year. That's not $253 million worth of helping, Eugene said. No, she agreed. It's not. But we've never been greedy people. We wouldn't know how to start now. Eugene found her hand under the blanket. What if we can't keep it? What if there are taxes or claims or legal problems? Then we deal with that when it comes. But right now, tonight, we know 3 things for certain. What 3 things? 1. Walter left this to you legally. 2. He documented everything carefully so it could be verified. And 3. He trusted you with something he spent his entire life building. Eugene thought about his uncle, the strange, quiet man who'd appeared at his mother's funeral and left without speaking. The hermit in the mountains who everyone thought was crazy or paranoid or both. What had Walter seen in his life that made him hide beauty underground? What had he witnessed that broke him so thoroughly he couldn't share what he'd preserved? Do you think he was happy? Eugene asked, living alone up there with all that treasure. No, Martha said softly. I don't think he was happy at all. I think he was haunted. The word hung in the darkness between them. Haunted. By what he'd seen. By the stories behind each piece. By the knowledge that every beautiful thing he'd saved had been torn from someone's hands, sometimes violently, always tragically. We can't let it haunt us too, Eugene said. No, Martha agreed, we can't. Dawn came slowly, grey light seeping through the thin curtains. Eugene and Martha rose stiff and exhausted, neither having slept more than an hour. Martha made coffee while Eugene sat at the table staring at nothing. Gladys knocked on the door at 7:30, earlier than decent, holding a plate of muffins. So? She demanded the moment Martha opened the door. Details, woman. What's the property like? Martha forced a smile. Old, needs a lot of work. Stone house, collapsed barn, overgrown everywhere. Worth anything? Hard to say. We need to get it appraised. Gladys looked disappointed again. Well, don't let anyone take advantage. You hear stories about people inheriting land and then getting cheated out of it by slick developers. We'll be careful, Martha promised. After Gladys left, Eugene looked at Martha. We need a plan. Agreed. First step, we call the lawyers. Tell them we've seen the property and want to proceed with the inheritance. Sign whatever papers are needed. Second step, we go back, alone. We inventory everything in that vault ourselves. We read every word in Walter's journal. We understand what we have before we tell anyone else. And third? Martha sat down across from him. Third, we find someone we can trust. A lawyer maybe, or an art expert. Someone who can tell us what our legal obligations are and what our options are. What if word gets out? Then we deal with it. But Eugene, people keep secrets in this town. Everyone's got something they don't want known. We just have to be smart about who we trust. Eugene nodded slowly. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was something. Structure, steps, a path forward through impossible terrain. They called the Helena Law Office at 9 o'clock. Yes, they'd seen the property. Yes, they wanted to accept the inheritance. Could they come in later that week to sign papers? The lawyer, a man named Richard Hanson, sounded pleased. Excellent. I'll have everything prepared. And Mr. Thomas, there are also some personal effects of your uncle's. Boxes of papers, photographs, that sort of thing. Would you like those as well? Yes, Eugene said. Everything. Very good. Shall we say Thursday at 2 o'clock? Perfect. After he hung up, Eugene felt slightly more in control. They had an appointment, a timeline, a next step. I'll drive us back tomorrow, Martha said. We'll spend the day there, really look at everything. Eugene agreed. Part of him never wanted to go back, wanted to seal that stone door forever and pretend they'd never found it. But another part, the part that remembered his uncle's final words in the journal, that part knew they had an obligation. Walter had protected these pieces for decades. Now it was their turn. They spent the rest of that day trying to act normal. Eugene worked on a neighbor's lawnmower that wouldn't start. Martha helped at the community center's food bank. They waved at people, made small talk, smiled when expected. And all the while, their minds were 90 miles away in an underground vault filled with impossible wealth. That evening, after dinner, they sat on their small porch and watched the sun set over the distant mountains. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridges and valleys, Walter's collection waited in darkness. "Do you think he ever showed anyone?" Martha asked. "In all those years, do you think anyone else saw it?" Eugene shook his head. "I don't think so. The dust on those stairs, it was thick everywhere except the path we walked. No footprints but ours." "So we're the first people to see it since he died. Maybe the first people to see it ever, besides him." Martha leaned her head on Eugene's shoulder. "That's so sad. All that beauty, all those stories, sitting in the dark for no one." "Until now," Eugene said. "Until now," she agreed. They sat together as darkness fell and the stars emerged, brighter out here away from city lights. Eugene thought about trajectories and timing, about how his mother's brother, a man he barely knew, had somehow changed their lives completely in a single afternoon. Tomorrow they'd go back. Tomorrow they'd begin to truly understand what they'd inherited. But tonight, for a few more hours, they were just Eugene and Martha, two elderly people on a porch, holding hands and watching stars. That's all they needed to be. The second trip to the property felt different. Eugene drove this time, hands steady on the wheel, jaw set with determination. Beside him, Martha had brought a notebook, 3 pens, and a digital camera they'd borrowed from Sarah at the trailer park. "We document everything," she'd said that morning. "Every single piece, every plaque, every entry in the journal. We need our own records." The drive took 2 hours because they stopped twice, once for gas and once because Eugene's hands started shaking so badly he had to pull over. Martha didn't comment, just held his hand until the trembling stopped. When they reached the clearing, everything looked the same as before. The stone house still stood silent. The collapsed barn still leaned into the earth. The metal shelter door still waited at the hillside's edge. They went straight to it this time. No hesitation. Eugene unlocked the padlock. They descended the stone stairs. The hidden door opened at Martha's touch, remembering where she'd pressed before. And then they were back in that impossible space, lights clicking on row by row as they walked deeper. Martha started at the far left, photographing each case from multiple angles, writing descriptions in her neat teacher's handwriting. Eugene read the journal cover to cover, taking notes on every entry, every acquisition, every story behind each piece. It took them 6 hours. 6 hours of standing in that cold underground chamber, surrounded by centuries of beauty and tragedy. By the time they finished, Martha had filled 47 pages in her notebook and taken over 300 photographs. Eugene had copied out every relevant detail from Walter's journal into a composition book they'd brought. They sat at Walter's desk, exhausted, surrounded by information that felt heavier than gold. 273 individual pieces, Martha said, reading from her notes. Some are sets, like the coin collection or the watch collection, but 273 distinct acquisitions, dating from as early as 400 BC to as recent as 2008, Eugene added. Walter was still buying pieces 16 years before he died. The documentation is meticulous, Martha continued. Every piece has provenance, receipts, authentication certificates. He kept everything. He also kept newspaper clippings, Eugene said, pointing to a folder he'd found in the desk drawer. Articles about art restitution, Holocaust survivors getting heirlooms back, museums returning stolen pieces. He was following the movement. Martha picked up one of the clippings. The headline read, "Families reunited with lost treasures after 70 years. The date was 1998. He wanted to return them," she said quietly. "That's why he documented everything so carefully. He was building a catalogue so someday these pieces could go back to whoever they belonged to. But he never did it. Maybe he couldn't find the families, or maybe he was too scared of the legal complications. Eugene stood and walked to the nearest case, the one holding the Fabergé butterfly brooch. $23 million for one piece of jewelry. He read the plaque again, noting the words, "Last known location, St. Petersburg, 1917. Martha, some of these pieces, the families that owned them, don't exist anymore. Whole bloodlines erased." "Then we find museums," she said. "Institutions that can display them, places where people can see them and learn the stories. And the pieces that can be returned to families. We return them." They looked at each other across the chamber, and in that moment, without speaking, they made their first real decision. They weren't going to keep this secret forever. They weren't going to hide these treasures the way Walter had. But they also weren't going to rush. They would be careful, methodical. They would honor Walter's work while finishing what he couldn't. "We need help," Eugene said. "Legal help, expert help. We can't do this alone." "Agreed. But who?" That was the question that followed them back up the stairs, back to the truck, back down the mountain. Who could they trust with something this valuable, this complicated, this dangerous? They spent the drive home brainstorming. Maybe the lawyer in Helena, Richard Hansen. Maybe an art professor at the university. Maybe a museum director who dealt with restitution cases. Each option had risks. Each person they told multiplied the chances of word spreading. By the time they reached Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park, they still hadn't decided, but they had agreed on one thing. They'd sign the inheritance papers on Thursday as planned, and they'd ask Richard Hansen for a recommendation. A careful question. Just looking for advice on valuable antiques found on inherited property. Nothing more specific. Not yet. That night, Eugene couldn't eat dinner. His stomach churned with anxiety. Martha noticed but didn't push, just cleared the plates and suggested they watch some television to take their minds off things. They were halfway through a rerun of an old game show when someone knocked on the door. Loud, urgent. Not Gladys's friendly tap or Frank's polite knock. This was demanding. Eugene looked at Martha. She looked back, fear flickering in her eyes. The knock came again. Eugene stood slowly and walked to the door. Through the small window, he could see a man he didn't recognize. Mid-40s, expensive suit, car behind him that cost more than their trailer. He opened the door but left the chain on. "Yes?" "Eugene Thomas?" the man asked. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is David Pierce. I'm a private acquisition specialist. I understand you recently inherited property from Walter Thomas." Eugene's blood went cold. "How did you know that?" "Estate filings are public record, Mr. Thomas. May I come in? I'd like to discuss something that could be very profitable for you." "We're not selling." "You don't even know what I'm offering." "Don't matter, not interested." David Pierce's smile faded slightly. "Mr. Thomas, I represent clients who are very interested in certain items that may be on your property, items your uncle acquired over the years. If those items exist, we're prepared to make you a very generous offer, enough money to change your life." "Our life is just fine," Eugene said, though his hand trembled on the doorframe. "Is it?" Pierce looked past Eugene to the trailer's shabby interior, to Martha standing in the small living room. "Living in a mobile home park at your age? Driving a truck older than some voters? I'm offering you a way out." "We're not interested," Eugene repeated, anger rising in his chest, "and I'd like you to leave." Pierce pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out. When Eugene didn't take it, he wedged it into the doorframe. "Think about it. My clients are patient, but they're also persistent. It would be better for everyone if we worked together." He walked back to his car, a black Mercedes that gleamed under the parking lot lights. Eugene watched him drive away before closing the door and locking it, adding the deadbolt they rarely used. Martha was pale. How did he know? Estate filings, he said. Public record. But how did he know about the collection? Eugene had no answer to that, unless someone had seen Walter buying pieces, unless Walter had been watched for years, unless the wrong people had been waiting for him to die. They didn't sleep that night either. Eugene kept getting up to check the windows, to peer through the curtains at the dark parking lot. Martha sat at the kitchen table making lists, trying to organize their thoughts, but the words kept blurring. By morning, they looked like ghosts of themselves. Eugene's hands shook so badly he could barely hold his coffee cup. Martha's face had a grayish tinge. "We need to move faster," she said. "We can't wait until Thursday. We need help now." Eugene nodded. "I'll call Hanson. Tell him we need to see him today." But when he called the law office, the secretary said Mr. Hanson was in court all day. Could he come in Friday instead? "No," Eugene said firmly. "It's urgent. We need to speak with someone about legal protection for inherited property." Something in his tone must have conveyed the seriousness. The secretary put him on hold, then came back. "Mr. Hanson can see you at 4 o'clock today. He's cutting his lunch short." "We'll be there." They drove to Helena that afternoon, Eugene pushing the old truck as fast as it would safely go. They arrived at the law office at 3:45, both of them looking rumpled and exhausted. Richard Hanson was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes. He shook their hands and ushered them into his office, noting their nervous energy. "Mr. Thomas, Mrs. Thomas, what can I do for you?" Eugene looked at Martha. She nodded. They'd agreed on the drive to be honest, at least partly. They needed real legal advice, and that required some truth. "The property we inherited," Eugene began. "It has valuable items on it, extremely valuable. And last night, a man came to our home, said he represented clients who wanted to buy them. We never told anyone what we found. The estate filing shouldn't have detailed contents. So how did he know?" Hanson's expression shifted from curious to concerned. "What kind of valuable items?" "Art," Martha said. "Antiques, coins, jewelry. My husband's uncle collected them over many decades." "How valuable are we talking?" Eugene's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Hundreds of millions of dollars." Hanson sat back in his chair hard enough to make it squeak. "I'm sorry, did you say hundreds of millions?" "Yes, sir." "And you have documentation? Provenance?" "Meticulous documentation. My uncle kept records of every purchase, every authentication, every detail." Hanson stood and walked to his window, looking out at Helena's quiet main street. When he turned back, his expression was grave. "Mr. Thomas, if what you're saying is true, you're in a very complicated situation. Items of that value attract attention from many parties, some legitimate, some not. The fact that someone approached you this quickly suggests your uncle may have been known in certain circles. Collectors, dealers, people who track these things." "What do we do?" Martha asked. Hanson thought for a moment. "First, we file for immediate legal protection of the estate. That prevents anyone from making claims without going through proper channels. Second, we need to verify what you have. I'll recommend an appraiser, someone discreet and trustworthy. Third, and this is critical, you don't tell anyone else. Not friends, not family, not neighbors. The fewer people who know, the safer you are." "We need more than that," Eugene said. "We need security, and we need to understand our tax obligations, and we need to know how to eventually do the right thing with these pieces." "The right thing?" "Some of them were lost in the Holocaust," Martha explained. "Others were taken from families that don't exist anymore. My husband's uncle documented everything because he wanted them to eventually be returned or displayed where they could honor the people they came from." Hanson's expression softened. "That's admirable and complicated. International restitution law is a minefield, but there are people who specialize in this. I can make calls." "How long before word spreads?" Eugene asked. If someone already knows enough to approach you, word has likely already spread in certain communities. But the general public, the media, they won't know unless someone tells them or unless filings become more specific. So we have time. Some, not much. I'd recommend you move quickly to secure the property, document everything officially, and begin the legal process of establishing what should happen to the collection. They left Hanson's office 2 hours later with a plan that felt slightly more solid. He'd file paperwork by the end of the day. He'd set up a meeting with a trusted appraiser for next week. He'd reach out to an expert in art restitution, and he'd look into security options for the property. But none of that stopped the knot in Eugene's chest, or the way Martha kept looking over her shoulder as they walked to the truck. On the drive home, they passed a grocery store. Martha suggested they stock up on supplies in case they needed to stay at the property for a while. As they walked through the aisles, Eugene noticed a man watching them. When he looked directly at him, the man turned away, but not before Eugene caught sight of a camera around his neck. "Martha," he whispered, "we're being followed." She looked where he indicated. The man had moved to the next aisle but was still watching through the shelving. They abandoned their cart and walked quickly to the truck. As Eugene pulled out of the parking lot, he saw a car pull out behind them. A different car, different person, but definitely following. Eugene's heart raced. He took several random turns, speeding up, then slowing down. The car stayed with them for 3 turns, then finally peeled off. "Oh God," Martha breathed. "What's happening?" "I don't know." But he did know in his gut. They'd stumbled into something bigger than an inheritance. Walter's collection wasn't just valuable, it was wanted, and people with money and resources were already circling. They made it back to Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park just before dark. As they pulled in, Eugene noticed a news van parked at the entrance. A reporter with a microphone was talking to Gladys, who was gesturing excitedly. "No," Eugene muttered. "No, no, no." He parked quickly and they rushed toward their trailer, but the reporter spotted them. Mr. Thomas, is it true you inherited a major art collection?" "No comment," Eugene said, fumbling with his keys. "Sources say your uncle was a known collector of Holocaust artifacts. Can you confirm?" Martha got the door open and they ducked inside, slamming it behind them. Through the window, they could see Gladys still talking to the reporter, hands waving as she recounted every detail of their trip to the property. "How does she know?" Martha asked, voice shaking. "We didn't tell her anything." "Someone talked," Eugene said. "Someone in Helena, or someone who knew Walter. It doesn't matter now. It's out." The phone started ringing. They stared at it. It rang 12 times before stopping, then immediately started again. Eugene unplugged it from the wall. They closed all the curtains and sat in the dim trailer, hearing voices outside, car doors, the reporter still asking questions of anyone who'd talk. "This is bad," Martha whispered. "Yeah. We need to go to the property, tonight. Make sure it's secure." Eugene wanted to argue, wanted to say they were too tired, too old, too scared. But she was right. If reporters knew, if collectors knew, if word was spreading, someone might try to access the vault. They packed quickly. Clothes, food, water, flashlights. Eugene grabbed a tire iron from under the seat of the truck, not sure what he'd do with it, but needing something. They slipped out the back door of the trailer while the reporter was interviewing Frank at the other end of the park. The drive to the property felt like a nightmare. Every pair of headlights behind them could be a tail. Every car parked on the shoulder could be someone watching. Eugene's chest hurt, a deep ache that made him worry about his heart. "You okay?" Martha asked, noticing him wince. "Yeah, just stressed." But he wasn't okay. The pressure in his chest grew worse. By the time they turned onto the Forest Service road, he was sweating despite the cold. "Eugene?" Martha's voice rose with concern. "I'm fine. Just let me get us there." He made it another mile before the pain became unbearable. He pulled over, gasping, one hand clutching his chest. "Hospital," Martha said firmly. "Now, I'm driving." "No, we need to—" "Hospital. Eugene Thomas. You're having a heart attack, and we're going to the hospital right now." They switched places, Martha taking the wheel despite her own fear. She drove back to the highway and then toward the nearest town with a medical center. Eugene slumped in the passenger seat, breathing shallow, face gray. What happens next will force them to make the most impossible choice of their lives. Reveal a truth about Walter's collection that changes everything, and show them that sometimes the bravest act is knowing when to let go. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The emergency room at Grant County Medical Center was small but efficient. Eugene was rushed back immediately when Martha used the words chest pain. She sat in the waiting room alone, surrounded by fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic, while her husband of 53 years fought for his life somewhere behind closed doors. She tried to pray but couldn't remember the words, tried to think clearly, but her mind kept circling back to the same question. Was this worth his life? 3 hours later, a doctor in blue scrubs found her. Eugene had suffered a minor heart attack brought on by extreme stress. They'd stabilized him, given him medication, but he needed to stay for observation, and he needed to eliminate whatever was causing such severe anxiety. "Can I see him?" Martha asked. "Yes, but keep it brief. He needs rest." Eugene looked small in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed. When he saw Martha, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She took his hand. "For what?" "For not being stronger. For letting this get to me. Eugene Thomas, you've been stronger than anyone has a right to expect. This isn't your fault." "But the collection—" "Can wait," she said firmly. "You cannot. Nothing in that vault is worth your life. Nothing." He closed his eyes. "What do we do?" Martha had been thinking about that in the waiting room, thinking about David Pierce's threatening visit, about the reporter at their home, about cars following them, about the way this inheritance had turned their quiet life into chaos in less than a week. "We ask for help," she said. "Real help. We stop trying to handle this alone." "Who?" "Hansen said he'd reach out to experts. We let him. We bring in security. We bring in appraisers. We bring in whoever needs to see that collection to make sure it's protected and catalogued and eventually goes where it should go. That means giving up control. It means accepting we never had control. Walter carried this burden alone for decades and it destroyed him. We've had it for a week and it nearly killed you. We're not meant to carry this alone." Eugene opened his eyes and looked at her. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just haven't always been listening." He smiled weakly, then winced. "Your hip. You need surgery. We could use the money for that." "I'll get my hip fixed when you're healthy, not before." They sat together in silence, the machines beeping steadily. After a while, Eugene spoke again, voice soft. "I keep thinking about the journal entries, the families that lost everything, how Walter tried to preserve their stories. I know. We can't let those pieces disappear again. We can't let them get sold off to private collectors who'll hide them away. That's not what Walter wanted." "So we don't," Martha said. "We make sure they're handled properly, donated to museums, returned to families if possible, displayed where people can learn from them. That'll take time, and money, and expertise we don't have. Then we find people who do." Eugene squeezed her hand. "Okay, when I get out of here, we do this right. We bring in the cavalry." Martha stayed with him until visiting hours ended, then drove back toward Pine Ridge in the dark. But she didn't go home. Instead, she drove to the property, compelled by something she couldn't name. The clearing was empty, the stone house dark. She parked and sat in the truck for a long moment, gathering courage. Then she grabbed a flashlight and walked to the shelter. The vault waited, silent and patient. Martha descended alone, the stone door opening at her touch. The lights clicked on, revealing the collection in all its impossible glory. She walked slowly through the rows, looking at each piece with new eyes, not seeing dollar signs anymore, seeing stories, lives, losses, hopes preserved in metal and canvas and stone. At the Fabergé butterfly brooch, she stopped. $23 million, owned by someone who died violently in a revolution over a century ago, preserved by a lonely man in Montana who never told anyone what he'd done. "What were you so afraid of, Walter?" she asked the empty vault. But she knew. He'd been afraid of this exact situation, afraid of greed, afraid of exploitation, afraid that by bringing these pieces to light, he'd dishonor the people they'd belonged to. But hiding them forever dishonored them too. Martha pulled out her phone and took a single photograph, the butterfly brooch gleaming under the lights. Then she typed a message to Richard Hansen. "We need to move forward immediately. My husband is in the hospital. This needs to end before it kills us both. Please help." She sent it, then turned off her phone. Before leaving, she stopped at Walter's desk. His journal sat open where Eugene had left it. Martha flipped to a page in the middle and read, "Entry 147, Silver Kiddush Cup, polish, circa 1890. Acquired from estate sale, Krakow, 1978. Belonged to the Goldberg family, deported to Treblinka, 1942. 6 family members perished, no survivors found. Purchased legally through Polish ministry. Price paid, 700 zloty. I bought this so their Sabbath prayers would not be forgotten. But who will remember when I am gone? Who will light candles for people whose names are lost?" Tears rolled down Martha's cheeks. Walter hadn't been a collector. He'd been a guardian, a keeper of memories, a man who'd tried to hold back the tide of forgetting. She closed the journal carefully and walked back through the vault, turning off lights as she went. At the stone stairs, she paused and spoke into the darkness. "We'll remember, Walter. I promise. We'll make sure people know their stories." The drive back to Pine Ridge took forever. By the time Martha pulled into the trailer park, it was after midnight. The news van was gone. The lights were out in all the other trailers. She let herself into their small home and collapsed onto the couch, too exhausted to make it to the bedroom. She woke to her phone ringing. Richard Hansen. "Mrs. Thomas, I got your message. I'm so sorry about your husband. How is he?" "Stable, recovering, but we can't keep doing this." "I understand. I've already made calls. I have an appraisal team ready to go to the property tomorrow if you'll allow it. I've also contacted a security firm that specializes in high-value estates. And I've reached out to Dr. Sarah Eisenberg at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. She handles restitution cases." Martha's breath caught. "Tomorrow?" "You said immediately. These people are the best, and they're willing to move fast, but only if you're comfortable. This is still your property, your decision." Martha thought about Eugene in that hospital bed, about Walter's journal, about the butterfly brooch and the silver cup and the 273 stories waiting in darkness. "Do it," she said. "Send them all." "There's something else you should know," Hansen said carefully. "Word has gotten out in collector circles. I've received 3 calls from various parties expressing interest in purchasing the collection. Sight unseen. One offer was for $80 million. $80 million. Enough to solve every problem they'd ever had. Enough to live like royalty for whatever years they had left." "And the other offers?" Martha asked. 120 and 200. $200 million, offered by people who'd never seen a single piece, based purely on Walter's reputation and rumors of what he'd gathered. "No," Martha said firmly. "No. Those pieces aren't for sale. They belong in museums or returned to families. That's what Walter wanted. That's what we're going to make sure happens." Hansen was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Thomas, I need to ask. Are you absolutely certain? That money could change your life." "It already has," she said. "Just not the way we expected. Send your people, Mr. Hansen. Let's finish what Walter started." After she hung up, Martha sat in the quiet trailer and felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, the exhaustion too, but underneath it all was something stronger: purpose. They weren't just inheriting property, they were inheriting a mission, and for the first time since opening that stone door, Martha felt certain they could complete it. She drove back to the hospital to tell Eugene. Eugene was sitting up in bed when Martha arrived the next morning, color back in his face, though he still looked fragile. The machines had been reduced to just one monitor tracking his heart rhythm. "You look like you slept," he said. "Couple hours. You?" "They gave me something, knocked me right out." He paused. "I've been thinking about how we've been trying to carry this alone, like Walter did, and how that almost killed me, just like it killed him." Martha sat in the chair beside his bed. "I called Hansen last night, told him to send everyone, appraisers, security, the Holocaust Museum expert. They're all coming to the property today." Eugene's eyes widened. "Today?" "We can't do this alone, Eugene. We need help, professional help, people who understand what these pieces mean and how to handle them properly." "You made that call without me?" "You were here fighting for your life. I made the call to save it." Eugene was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. "You always were the brave one." "Not brave, desperate. There's a difference." "What did Hansen say?" Martha told him everything: the appraisal team, the security firm, Dr. Eisenberg from the Holocaust Museum, and the offers: 80 million, 120 million, 200 million. Eugene's face went pale again. $200 million and you said no? "I said those pieces aren't for sale. They belong to the families or museums. That's what Walter wanted." "Martha, Eugene Thomas, you listen to me. We've lived 70-something years without millions of dollars. We've been happy. We've had each other. That collection isn't ours to sell. It's ours to protect until we can give it to the people who should have it." Tears filled Eugene's eyes. "What if we can't afford your surgery?" "Then I'll live with a bad hip. But I won't live knowing we sold off pieces that belong to murdered families just so I could walk better." Eugene reached for her hand. "When did I get lucky enough to marry a saint? I'm not a saint. I'm just tired of being scared, tired of letting greed and fear make our decisions. Walter lived in fear his whole life. I won't do the same." A knock on the door interrupted them. A nurse poked her head in. "Mr. Thomas, the doctor says if you continue improving, you can go home tomorrow, but you need to avoid stress completely. Doctor's orders." After the nurse left, Eugene looked at Martha. "How am I supposed to avoid stress when our property is being descended upon by experts and we're sitting on $250 million worth of treasure?" "Because we're not sitting on it anymore," Martha said. "We're handing it over to people who know what to do with it. Our job is just to say yes to the right things and no to the wrong things." "And who decides which is which?" "We do, together, the way we've made every decision for 53 years. Eugene squeezed her hand. "Okay, what happens next?" "Next, you rest and get better. I drive to the property and meet with the experts. Hansen will be there. I'll have my phone. If there are any big decisions, we make them together." "You shouldn't go alone." "I won't be alone. There'll be a dozen professionals there." Eugene wanted to argue, but the exhaustion hit him hard. His eyes drooped. "Call me," he mumbled. "Every hour." "Every hour," she promised. By the time Martha reached the property that afternoon, there were 5 vehicles already parked in the clearing. Hansen stood by the stone house talking to a woman in a professional pantsuit. 2 men in security uniforms were walking the perimeter, and near the shelter entrance, 3 people with camera equipment and laptop cases waited. Hansen saw Martha's truck and walked over immediately. "Mrs. Thomas, thank you for coming. Let me introduce everyone." The woman in the pantsuit was Claire Morrison, senior appraiser from Heritage International. The security men were from a firm that specialized in high-value estate protection. The three by the shelter were the documentation team, professional archivists who would photograph and catalogue everything. "And this," Hansen said, gesturing to an older woman who'd just emerged from a rental car, "is Dr. Sarah Eisenberg from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum." Dr. Eisenberg was perhaps 70, with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering. She shook Martha's hand gently. "Mrs. Thomas, Richard has told me a bit about what you've found. If even half of it is accurate, this is one of the most significant private collections I've encountered." "It belonged to my husband's uncle," Martha said, "Walter Thomas. He spent his life acquiring these pieces legally, documenting everything. But I think he always meant for them to be returned or displayed properly. He just didn't know how." Dr. Eisenberg's expression softened. "Then let's help him finish what he started." Martha led them all to the shelter. When she opened the hidden stone door and the lights clicked on in the vault below, she heard gasps. Claire Morrison actually stumbled, catching herself on the railing. "My God," the appraiser whispered. They descended slowly, the entire team, and fanned out into the chamber. For several minutes, no one spoke. They just walked among the cases, staring at treasures that shouldn't exist in a Montana hillside. Dr. Eisenberg stopped at the case containing the silver Kiddush cup Martha had read about in Walter's journal. Her hand trembled as she touched the glass. "This belonged to the Goldberg family," she said, reading the plaque. "I know this piece. It was listed in testimony from a Treblinka survivor who saw it taken during a deportation. We thought it was lost forever." "Walter bought it legally in 1978, Martha said, "from an estate sale in Krakow. It's all documented in his journal." "May I see the journal?" Martha showed her to Walter's desk. Dr. Eisenberg sat down and began reading, tears streaming down her face as she went through entry after entry. Each piece, each story, each family. "This man," she said finally, looking up at Martha. "Your husband's uncle. He was trying to save their memories." "Yes. We need to tell their stories. Every single one." While Dr. Eisenberg read the journal, Claire Morrison and her team began the appraisal process. They photographed each piece from multiple angles, checked authentication certificates, verified provenance documentation. The work was meticulous and slow. Martha called Eugene every hour as promised. His voice grew stronger with each call, animated as she described what was happening. Experts confirming Walter's records, pieces being authenticated, values being verified. "How much?" he asked during the fourth call. "They're not even halfway through, but Claire said the paintings alone could be worth over $100 million. Eugene was quiet. "That much. That much. And Eugene, Dr. Eisenberg wants to return at least 40 pieces to families. She's already identified 3 that have living descendants." Living descendants? Grandchildren of the original owners. They've been searching for these pieces for decades. She says returning them would be one of the greatest restitution moments in recent history. Eugene's voice cracked. Walter would want that. "I know." The work continued for 3 days. The team worked from dawn until dark, camping in tents near the property because no one wanted to leave. Martha drove back and forth between the hospital and the property, bridging the 2 worlds. By the 3rd day, Claire Morrison had completed her appraisal. She called everyone together in the vault and read from her tablet. Total verified value of the Walter Thomas collection, $268,700,000. The number hung in the air. "That's based on current market values," she continued. "Some pieces could appreciate significantly if properly displayed or if competing buyers emerge, but this is the conservative estimate." "And the tax implications?" Martha asked. Hansen answered, "Substantial. The estate will owe approximately 40% in federal taxes. That's roughly $107 million. Martha's head spun. Even after taxes, they'd have over $160 million left. More money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. But Dr. Eisenberg spoke up. There's another option. If you donate the collection to a qualified institution, the estate could claim a charitable deduction. Depending on how it's structured, you could significantly reduce or potentially eliminate the tax burden while ensuring these pieces go where they should. Explain, Martha said. You could establish a foundation, donate the collection to it. The foundation becomes a museum, educational institution, and restitution center. You'd maintain some involvement in decision-making, but the pieces would be protected and displayed publicly. The tax deduction would offset the estate taxes. And we'd get nothing? Martha asked. Not nothing, Hansen interjected. The foundation would employ staff, including yourselves if you chose. You could take reasonable salaries, and certain personal expenses could be covered, like your medical care or housing, if structured properly within foundation guidelines. Martha looked at the vault around them, at Walter's careful documentation, at the pieces that represented so many lost lives. How long would it take to set up? 3 to 6 months to establish properly, Hansen said, but we could begin the process immediately. Martha pulled out her phone and called Eugene, put him on speaker so everyone could hear. Eugene, they want to know if we'll donate the collection to create a foundation, a museum, a place where people can see these pieces and learn the stories behind them. We'd get to help run it, take salaries, have our medical care covered, but the collection wouldn't be ours to sell. Eugene didn't hesitate. Do it. You're sure? Martha, I've had 3 days in this hospital bed to think about what matters. It's not money. It's not having the biggest bank account when we die. It's doing something that means something. Walter spent his life on this. We should spend what's left of ours finishing it right. Dr. Eisenberg wiped her eyes. Mr. Thomas, your uncle would be proud. I hope so, Eugene said quietly. The work shifted then. Instead of just documenting, they began planning. Where would the foundation be located? How would the museum be designed? What educational programs would it offer? Who would they partner with for restitution efforts? Dr. Eisenberg suggested they work with multiple organizations: the Holocaust Museum, the World Jewish Congress, Interpol's Art Theft Division, UNESCO's Memory of the World Program. Each piece that could be returned would be. Each piece that couldn't would be displayed with full context about the families it came from. Claire Morrison suggested they also include public days where people could bring in items for free authentication and appraisal, helping other families potentially discover their own lost treasures. Hansen recommended they create scholarship programs for students studying art history, Holocaust studies, and cultural preservation. By the end of the week, they had the framework for something unprecedented: the Walter and Eugene Thomas Foundation for Cultural Preservation and Remembrance. Eugene came home from the hospital to find Martha surrounded by paperwork, laptop open, phone ringing constantly. She looked exhausted but alive in a way he hadn't seen in years. You're building an empire, he said, settling carefully onto the couch beside her. I'm building a legacy, she corrected. Ours and Walter's. When do we tell people? The neighbors? The town? Hansen says we announce once the foundation paperwork is filed, maybe another week. But they didn't have a week. The next morning, the story broke. Someone, probably one of the appraisal team or a security guard, leaked details to the press. By noon, every major news outlet was running headlines: elderly Montana couple inherits $200 million Holocaust treasure trove. The phone rang non-stop. Reporters camped outside Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park. Helicopters flew over the property. Eugene and Martha's faces were suddenly on television screens across the country. Gladys knocked on the door, eyes wide. Is it true? All of it? Martha let her in, too tired to lie anymore. Yes. And you're giving it all away? We're creating a foundation. The pieces will be displayed publicly and returned to families when possible. Gladys sat down hard. You could have been millionaires. We already are millionaires, Eugene said. just not the way people think. But you're living in a trailer. For now, Martha said. The foundation will provide housing as part of our employment, something comfortable but not ostentatious. We're not interested in mansions. Gladys looked at them like they'd lost their minds. You're crazy, both of you. Probably, Eugene agreed, but we're happy crazy. After Gladys left, Eugene and Martha sat together on their small porch, watching news vans circle like vultures. Any regrets? Eugene asked. Martha thought about it. No. You? Not one. Even though we could have taken the 200 million and run, especially because we didn't. The foundation paperwork was filed 3 weeks later. The Walter and Eugene Thomas Foundation for Cultural Preservation and Remembrance officially came into existence on a cold November morning. The property was transferred to the foundation. The collection was donated. Tax documents were filed. And then the real work began. Dr. Eisenberg identified 47 pieces that had living descendants. The process of returning them began immediately. The first piece to be returned was the silver Kiddush cup from the Goldberg family. Martha and Eugene flew to New York, their first time on a plane in over 20 years, to meet the Goldberg descendant. Her name was Rachel Klein, 63 years old, a librarian from Queens. Her grandmother had survived Treblinka. Her great-grandfather had not. They met in a private room at the Holocaust Museum. Rachel's hands shook as Claire Morrison placed the small silver cup on the table in front of her. This belonged to your great-great-grandfather, Dr. Eisenberg said gently. It was used in your family's home in Poland for Sabbath blessings. It survived when so many did not. Rachel picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands. There were Hebrew letters engraved on the base. She traced them with one finger, crying silently. My grandmother told me about this, she whispered. She said the Nazis took it when they emptied their house. She thought she'd never see anything from home again. She died 5 years ago, still mourning it. Your Uncle Walter saved it, Martha said. He bought it legally, documented it, and preserved it so that someday it could come home. Rachel looked up at them, tears streaming. Why? Why would a stranger do that? Eugene found his voice. Because he believed some things are more important than money. Memory, history, connection. He couldn't bring back the people who were lost, but he could save the objects that proved they existed. Rachel held the cup to her chest and wept. And Martha wept with her. And Eugene. And Dr. Eisenberg. And even the stoic Claire Morrison dabbed at her eyes. That moment was replicated 46 more times over the next year. Each return was different. Some families cried, some stood in stunned silence, some prayed, some laughed with disbelief. But every single one was transformed by getting back a piece of their history they thought was lost forever. The media covered each return. Eugene and Martha became unexpected celebrities, but they always deflected attention to Walter, to the families, to the importance of remembering. We're just the delivery people, Martha told one reporter. Walter did the real work. We're just making sure it reaches the right destination. While the restitutions continued, the foundation broke ground on a museum, not in Helena or any big city, but in the small town nearest to Walter's property, a town called Pine Creek that had been dying slowly for decades. The museum would be modest but beautiful, designed to blend into the mountain landscape, one wing for permanent displays, one wing for temporary exhibits, a research library, a conservation lab, an auditorium for educational programs. Construction created jobs, local contractors, electricians, plumbers, carpenters. The town began to revive. New businesses opened anticipating tourism, a bed and breakfast, a cafe, a bookstore specializing in history and art. Eugene and Martha moved into a small house near the museum site. Nothing fancy, 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, a porch with a view of the mountains. They furnished it from the same thrift stores they'd always shopped at, though now they could afford new. "Why buy new when this works fine?" Martha said, arranging a used lamp on a side table. Eugene smiled. "Old habits." "Good habits." They kept their old truck too, though the foundation offered to buy them something new. Eugene just got the engine rebuilt and called it good enough. But they did splurge on two things: Eugene's medications, no longer rationed or skipped, and Martha's hip surgery. She had it done at a top orthopedic center and recovered faster than expected. By the time the museum opened, she was walking without pain for the first time in years. The grand opening of the Walter and Eugene Thomas Foundation Museum happened on a perfect September day, 2 years after they'd first opened that stone door. Over 500 people attended: Holocaust survivors and their families, art historians, government officials, reporters, and the entire population of Pine Creek, including Gladys and Frank and Sarah and everyone from Pine Ridge Mobile Home Park. Eugene and Martha stood at the entrance, greeting people. Eugene in a suit they'd bought for the occasion, Martha in a simple dress, both of them looking overwhelmed and proud and slightly terrified. Dr. Eisenberg gave the keynote speech. She talked about Walter Thomas, a man she'd never met but whose work had changed her own. She talked about the courage it took to preserve difficult histories. And she talked about Eugene and Martha, who'd chosen legacy over luxury. "In a world that often values profit over principle," she said, "these two people remind us that the greatest wealth is measured not in what we keep, but in what we give away." The crowd rose to its feet. Eugene and Martha stood together, hands clasped, tears streaming. After the ceremony, the museum opened its doors. People filed through slowly, reverently. Each piece was displayed with full context: the family it came from, the history behind it, the story of how Walter acquired it, and when possible, photos and testimonies from survivors. In the center of the main gallery, a special exhibit featured pieces that had been returned to families, along with photos of the return moments. Rachel Klein with her silver Kiddush cup, a man in Poland receiving his grandfather's prayer book, a woman in Israel holding her grandmother's wedding ring. Martha stood in that gallery watching visitors read each story, many crying, all transformed. She felt Eugene beside her and leaned into him. "We did it," she whispered. "We did. Walter would be proud. I think he's probably smiling somewhere." They watched an elderly woman stop at one display, then gasp and call to her grandson. Together they stared at a painting, the woman explaining through tears that it looked just like the one her mother had described from their home in Vienna. Dr. Eisenberg approached them. "We've had 12 inquiries already from people who think they might recognize pieces. The research begins." "More reunions?" Martha asked. "Hopefully many more." Over the following months, the museum became more than they'd imagined. School groups came from across Montana and beyond. Researchers used the library. Survivors gave testimonies that were recorded and preserved. Educational programs taught about the Holocaust, about art theft, about cultural preservation. The foundation also established scholarship programs. The Martha Thomas Teaching Fellowship for educators studying Holocaust education. The Eugene Thomas Technical Scholarship for students pursuing conservation and restoration careers, and the Walter Thomas Research Grant for historians studying cultural theft and restitution. The scholarships would continue forever, funded by careful investment of a small portion of the collection's value that Hansen had helped them preserve. They'd kept back 5 pieces, sold them legally through major auction houses for just over $30 million, and invested the money conservatively to fund operations in perpetuity. Eugene and Martha both worked at the museum. Eugene gave tours, sharing Walter's story and answering questions about the collection's history. Martha developed educational curriculum and trained volunteer docents. They each drew modest salaries, enough to live comfortably, but not extravagantly. Their favorite days were when survivor families visited. Eugene would sit with them for hours, listening to their stories, looking at old photographs, helping them search through the Foundation's records for any possible connections to pieces that hadn't been identified yet. Martha worked with children, teaching them about the importance of preserving history and standing up against hatred. She'd developed a program where students could handle reproduction pieces and learn conservation techniques. One afternoon, 3 years after the museum opened, Martha was working with a group of fifth graders when she looked up to see Eugene standing in the doorway. He was watching her teach, the same way he'd watched her for 56 years, with complete admiration. When the class ended and the children filed out, he walked over. "You're good at this," he said. "I was a teacher for 40 years. I'd hope I'd be good at it." "No, I mean this specifically. Making history matter to kids who weren't even born when these events happened." Martha smiled. "History only matters if we make it personal. These kids, they need to see themselves in these stories, see that ordinary people made choices that had extraordinary consequences, good and bad. Like us. We're not extraordinary. Martha Thomas, you inherited a fortune and gave it all away to honor people you never met. That's pretty extraordinary. We gave it away because keeping it would have dishonored them. That's not extraordinary. That's just decent." Eugene kissed her forehead. "Well, you're my extraordinary." That evening, they drove back to Walter's original property. The stone house had been restored as part of the Foundation, turned into a residence for visiting scholars and researchers. The barn had been stabilized, the grounds maintained. But the shelter remained as it was, with the vault below preserved exactly as Walter had left it. Twice a year the Foundation offered special behind-the-scenes tours, where small groups could descend into the original vault and see where the collection had been hidden. Eugene and Martha always led these tours personally. That night they descended the stone stairs alone. The vault was empty now, all the pieces moved to the museum. But the display cases remained, the lights still worked, and Walter's desk sat in the same spot. Martha sat in Walter's chair and opened the journal, which they'd left here as part of the historical preservation. She read one of the middle entries aloud, her voice echoing in the empty chamber. Entry 192. Emerald bracelet, Austrian, circa 1920. Acquired from private sale, Vienna, 1984. Belonged to the Weiss family, murdered at Sobibor, 1943. Their story should not end with their death. This bracelet survives as proof they lived, they loved, they mattered. She closed the book gently. He understood something most people don't, that objects carry memory. They're not just things, they're witnesses. Eugene stood in the center of the empty vault, turning slowly. "I wonder what he'd think of the museum, of what we built." "I think he'd be relieved," Martha said. "Relieved someone finally finished what he started. Relieved the burden passed to someone who cared." "You know what I think about?" Eugene said. "I think about how we almost didn't open that stone door, how we almost just locked the shelter and walked away. But we didn't. But we almost did. And if we had all of this, the reunions, the museum, the scholarships, the stories being told, none of it would exist." Martha stood and walked to him. "But we did open it. We did do the hard thing. We did make the right choice, even when it was terrifying. And we did it together. Always together." They held each other in the empty vault, two people in their 80s who'd stumbled into something bigger than themselves, and somehow found the courage to honor it properly. On their way out, Eugene stopped at the stone door. "Should we seal it? Make it so no one can open it again?" Martha thought about it. "No, leave it open. This isn't a tomb anymore. It's a reminder, proof that secrets kept in darkness eventually need light." They climbed the stairs and emerged into the Montana evening. Stars were appearing, bright and infinite. They stood together looking up, the way they had on their porch at the trailer park, the way they'd done for 56 years. "Do you ever miss it?" Eugene asked. "The simple life, before all this?" "Our life is still simple," Martha said. "We just have a bigger purpose now." "True, Though I do miss Gladys's terrible casseroles." Martha laughed. "We'll invite her to the museum next week. She can bring one." "You're a cruel woman. You married me anyway." They drove back to their small house in comfortable silence. Inside, Martha made tea while Eugene checked messages. 3 families had reached out through the Foundation website, each claiming possible connections to pieces in the collection. Dr. Eisenberg would investigate. That night, lying in their comfortable but modest bed, Eugene spoke into the darkness. "Martha? Thank you." "For what?" "For being brave when I couldn't be. For making the right choice when I wanted to run. For seeing what this could become when I only saw danger." Martha rolled to face him. "Eugene Thomas, we made every choice together. You were just as brave. You had a heart attack and still wanted to protect that collection. That's courage. We're quite a pair. The best pair." They fell asleep holding hands, the way they had for 56 years, the way they would for however many years remained. The foundation continued to grow. 4 years after opening, they'd returned 73 pieces to families, established partnerships with museums in 12 countries, educated over 50,000 students, and awarded hundreds of scholarships. The museum had become one of Montana's most visited cultural sites, bringing tourism revenue and pride to Pine Creek. Eugene and Martha were interviewed by national publications, invited to speak at conferences, recognized by preservation organizations. But they always remained the same, modest, kind, focused on the work rather than the recognition. On their 60th wedding anniversary, the foundation threw them a celebration at the museum. Survivors flew in from around the world, families whose heirlooms had been returned, students whose educations had been funded, town members whose lives had been changed by the economic revival. Rachel Klein, the librarian from Queens who'd received her family's Kiddush cup, gave a speech. "Eugene and Martha didn't just give me back a piece of silver. They gave me back my history, my grandmother's prayers, my family's memory. They proved that goodness still exists in a world that often feels dark. They chose light, and that light will shine for generations." Eugene and Martha sat together, overwhelmed, watching a room full of people whose lives they'd touched without trying to. They hadn't set out to be heroes. They'd just tried to do right by a lonely man's legacy and ended up changing the world a little bit. Later, when the party had ended and guests had gone, they walked through the quiet museum. Their museum now, though it never felt like possession, more like stewardship, sacred duty. In the main gallery, they stopped at a new display. It featured a photograph of Walter Thomas, taken sometime in the 1960s, standing beside a display case. In the photo, he looked haunted, alone, carrying invisible weight. Beside that photo was a recent one of Eugene and Martha, surrounded by smiling faces at a restitution ceremony. The contrast was stark. Walter alone with his secrets. Eugene and Martha surrounded by community, by purpose, by connection. Martha touched Walter's photograph gently. "We freed you," she whispered. "We freed all of it." Eugene put his arm around her. "And ourselves." They continued walking, their footsteps echoing in the empty space, past paintings that had been hidden for decades, now illuminated and appreciated, past jewelry that had been locked away, now displayed with dignity, past coins and manuscripts and artifacts, each one telling a story that mattered. At the exit, they paused at the mission statement engraved on the wall. The Walter and Eugene Thomas Foundation exists to preserve cultural heritage, honor lost voices, reunite families with their history, and educate future generations about the importance of remembering. Some things are worth more than money. Some legacies are meant to be shared. "Did we do enough?" Eugene asked, a question he asked often. Martha squeezed his hand. "We did everything we could. Walter gathered the pieces. We brought them home. Together, we completed something beautiful. But there's still work to do. There will always be work to do. That's the point. We started something that will continue long after we're gone. They locked the museum doors and walked to their truck, Eugene's hand finding Martha's like it had thousands of times before. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, families were discovering connections to pieces in the collection. Researchers were uncovering stories. Students were learning lessons that would shape their understanding of history and humanity. And in a small house near the museum, two elderly people who'd inherited a fortune and given it all away would sleep soundly, knowing they'd chosen right over easy, legacy over luxury, light over darkness. Because some fortunes aren't measured in dollars. Some inheritances are meant to be shared. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open a door, step into the unknown, and trust that what you find there is meant to change not just your life, but the lives of countless others. Martha and Eugene Thomas had done that, and in doing so, they'd proven that age is no barrier to purpose, that poverty of wallet doesn't mean poverty of spirit, and that two ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort. Walter's collection was no longer hidden, the stories were no longer silent, and the legacy of three people, one who gathered, two who shared, would echo forward through generations yet to come. Anyone can find treasure if they're brave enough to open doors others are afraid to touch. And anyone can change the world if they're willing to give away what others would hoard. As Martha once told a reporter who asked why they gave it all away, keeping it would have made us rich, sharing it made us whole. And on a quiet Montana mountainside, in a museum filled with light and memory, that wholeness continued to grow, one story, one reunion, one student, one day at a time. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the greatest inheritance is the one you pass forward.